Mr. James Carter, a black man in his 60s, exuded an aura of dignity and calm despite the ordeal he faced. Always dapper, dressed in a perfectly pressed suit and polished shoes, he stood stoically at an international airport checkpoint. His imposing stature, his impeccable appearance, and the serenity in his eyes should have been enough to inspire respect, but the two officers present seemed determined to remind him that these qualities did not count here. The first officer, stocky and with rough features, looked at him with a crooked smile, a mixture of condescension and contempt displayed. His tone, honeyed but sharp, left no doubt about his intentions. "You'll have to wait here," he declared with undisguised satisfaction. "We can't let someone like you pass without checking. You understand, sir." Every word was weighed, but it was the "you" that the officer pressed heavily, transforming it into an implicit insult, an attack on James' very dignity. Next door, his colleague, a younger but equally unpleasant man, observed the scene with an amused grin, as if the humiliation of a deserving man was a welcome distraction from his day. James remained impassive. He had learned, over the decades, to control his emotions in such situations. He just stared at the officer, his piercing gaze calmly sweeping away the smirks. Refusing to give in to provocation, he stood straight, hands crossed in front of him, as if he were facing a storm that he knew was passing. This wasn't the first time he'd been judged before he even had the chance to present himself, and unfortunately, he knew it wouldn't be the last. Around him, the passengers passed quickly, carefully avoiding meeting his eyes. Some, visibly embarrassed by the scene, murmured among themselves as they continued on their way, carrying their discomfort with them. Others cast furtive glances, curious but silent, involuntary witnesses to trivialized injustice. For James, every second of this disguised interrogation was a wake-up call. It was not just him who was being judged, but everything he represented. However, he did not give in to either irritation or anger. He knew that his strength lay in his calm, in his ability to remain dignified even in the face of indignity. The wait dragged on, and the heavy silence seemed to amplify each second. One of the officers, unable to hide his irritation at James' unwavering calm, finally broke down. He approached abruptly, his eyes flashing with anger, his clenched jaw betraying a frustration he struggled to contain. "I speak to you. You listen to me when I speak to you," he shouted, his voice echoing in the space, attracting the gazes of the surrounding passers-by. James slowly looked up at him, still impassive. He responded in a calm voice, his controlled tone contrasting with the aggressiveness of his interlocutor. "I'm cooperating. Do your checks." These words, although impeccable, had the effect of a spark on powder already ready to explode. The officer, visibly unsettled by James' calm, lost what remained of his composure. In a burst of uncontrolled rage, he grabbed James by the arm and violently pushed him against a metal barrier. The shock caused a dull noise to resonate in the terminal, breaking the apparent indifference of passers-by. A murmur of indignation ran through the crowd. Outraged looks turned towards the scene, but no one dared to intervene. The second officer, visibly taken by surprise, tried to calm his colleague. "Hey, calm down. It's not necessary." But it was too late. In an impulsive move, the angry officer raised his hand and punched James in the face. The violence of the attack made James stagger, and he instinctively grabbed the barrier to keep his balance. Despite the pain, he refused to give in. Straightening his back, he stared straight into the officer's eyes, his gaze proud and stoic, like a mountain facing a storm. His features, marked by age and experience, expressed a mixture of dignity and silent defiance. The shocked crowd seemed paralyzed. Some whispered among themselves, expressing their indignation, but their voices remained timid, muffled by the fear of getting involved. A woman whispered to her companion, "This is unacceptable. They have no right." It was at this precise moment, when the atmosphere was tense and James' humiliation seemed to be at its peak, that a dull noise of engines abruptly interrupted the scene. An imposing convoy of black cars with tinted windows had just screeched to a halt at the entrance to the airport, whispering the arrival of a high-ranking personality. The agitation spread like a shockwave among the employees and passers-by, who exchanged worried glances. "It's the governor," murmured a voice in the crowd, with astonishing precision. Barely had these words been spoken when the main door opened with a discreet rumble, revealing an imposing figure. The state governor, surrounded by his bodyguards, entered the hall with a confident gait, his piercing gaze scanning the room as if trying to take in every detail of what was happening around him. He only needed a moment to notice the scene at the checkpoint, and his gaze immediately landed on James. A flash of recognition crossed his eyes, but his expression remained frozen for a moment, as if the reality he saw defied his understanding. His features, at first neutral and controlled, hardened into a mixture of anger and dismay as he fully understood the situation. He moved quickly, the tension palpable in every movement, his step ringing with a determination that none of those present would have dared ignore. The two officers, suddenly aware of who was in front of them, awkwardly tried to stand up. They exchanged a panicked look before turning to the governor. One of them, more nervous than ever, stammered words that no longer made any sense. "Mr. Governor," he stammered, a bead of sweat beading on his forehead, "we have a suspect here, and we're making sure he doesn't pose a threat." The governor ignored them completely, his eyes never leaving James. With a confident movement, he positioned himself in front of him, raising his stature and imposing a heavy silence around him. His gaze swept over the arrogant officer, then slowly settled on his father, James. The contrast was stark, a clash between the all-powerful authority of the uniforms and the silent dignity of a man whose story far exceeded the injustice of a moment. "A suspect," he repeated slowly, his voice betraying controlled anger. "This man is my father." The silence that followed was almost supernatural. Like a blade falling on the assembly, each word of the governor seemed to weigh tons. The two officers, frozen in shock at this revelation, immediately turned pale. One of them took a step back, as if James' mere presence was becoming too large to be contained in this small space. The other, too destabilized to react, opened and closed his mouth several times, the words escaping him like an ordeal he should never have faced. Passers-by, until then silent spectators of the incident, observed the scene with amazement. Some had instinctively recognized the governor when he arrived, but the revelation of his relationship with James left them speechless. Those who had been filming the incident up until that moment froze, the screens of their phones now showing a scene much larger than they had imagined capturing. The governor finally turned his gaze on the two officers, his eyes filled with a new authority, devoid of any clemency. It was clear that for them, what had started as a simple routine check would turn into a confrontation with a much larger and more formidable power. "You have lost all decency," he said coldly, his voice seeming to take away any trace of confidence they might still have. "I will personally take care of this matter. And you too, you are not cut out to wear a uniform." His words sounded like a verdict. A heavy silence fell over the room as passers-by began to understand the depth of what they had just seen. The governor, whose anger had now given way to icy authority, pointed the finger at the officer who had struck James. The governor's gaze, piercing and implacable, fixed on the man, piercing his every movement. "You dared to raise your hands on an innocent man, without any proof. Not just on a man, but on my father," he said in a voice as firm as a bell ringing the alarm. Each word vibrated in the air, charged with the force of an indisputable truth. The officer, now livid, stiffened on the spot, his throat tight with shame that he could no longer hide. His hands shook slightly as he tried to justify himself, but his voice, far too weak, did not have the force of his actions. "Sir, I didn't know." The merciless governor did not even have a shadow of hesitation before interrupting this attempt at defense, his voice sharp as a blade. "And what does that change?" The silence that followed was heavy and oppressive. The governor's gaze intensified, boring into that of the officer, who now seemed to be reduced to his own guilt. The governor continued, each syllable weighing on the officer's soul like a condemnation. "The fact that you don't know who he is further proves your incompetence and prejudice. You saw a well-dressed black man and thought that was enough to treat him like a criminal. You didn't even bother to check who he was before humiliating and attacking him." The officer tried to open his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat, unable to justify the unjustifiable. The crowd around him, which until then had observed in silence, seemed to hang on every word of the governor. Murmurs of disapproval slowly circulated among the witnesses, some exchanging glances that seemed to say everything words could not express. The governor, seeing the uselessness of the officer's excuses, turned to James for a moment, offering the man a silent but respectful acknowledgement. Then he straightened up, reaffirming his posture as an indisputable leader, and directed his gaze again towards the officer. "You don't deserve this job. It's not just a question of bad decisions, it's a question of fundamental values. And you have failed in every single one of them," he added, each word striking the officer like an invisible slap. James, although bruised, raised a hand to interrupt his son. The governor, surprised but respectful, stopped, allowing James to speak. The black man in his 60s, with his erect posture and implacable gaze, slowly turned towards the officers, as if observing them not only for who they were, but for what they embodied in society. He cleared his throat, and his words, although low, sounded like a clap of thunder. "Let me say something," he said calmly, but with a natural authority that silenced the atmosphere. He turned slowly towards the two officers, his eyes piercing their souls as if he read their every thought, every prejudice. His voice, deep and powerful, broke the silence. "What you did today doesn't just hurt me. It hurts every person you treat like this. You think your uniform gives you the right to humiliate? You think power is yours just because you wear a star on your chest? No, that gives you the duty to protect and respect, not to destroy people's dignity." He paused, his gaze hardening even further. His words were not just a rebuke. They were a declaration of resistance, a call to the conscience of those who believe themselves above basic human laws. You think you are superior because you have a badge, but you have forgotten the reason why you wear this badge. It is not there to humiliate or crush, but to serve. You have forgotten it, but I will never forget that. Despite your actions, I am still a man, and you are responsible for your actions. The governor, listening to his father, placed a hand on his shoulder, as if to offer him a moment of support, a gesture of father-son solidarity that went beyond titles and positions of power. He looked at James with deep admiration, and without a word, he turned to the crowd to reinforce the truth he had just heard. What you saw here today is an example of the daily injustice that too many people experience. This is not an isolated incident. This is not a simple mistake. This is a system that is failing every day to recognize the humanity of some of us, and this must stop. He paused, his eyes scanning the faces in the room, and his tone became firmer, more determined. And believe me, these men will answer for their actions. No one is above the law, not even those who are supposed to uphold it. Under the governor's eyes, a heavy silence was felt. Passers-by, until then mute spectators, began to murmur among themselves, their voices mixed with support and reflection. Some shook their heads in indignation, others gave looks of respect and admiration towards James and his son, witnesses of a scene where justice was not just a concept, but a reality put into practice. Action. The two officers, with their heads bowed, understood that it was useless to defend themselves any further. They no longer had a place in this scene of truth. Their excuses were in vain. Their denial was too late. In a public humiliation they would not soon forget, they were escorted from the hall by security guards, their faces turned white with the weight of dishonor. James and his son, side by side, left the airport, their silhouettes a stark contrast to the disapproving faces of the officers. As they walked away, a sort of respect and dignity was evident in the eyes of the witnesses, a silent recognition of the justice done, even in the absence of a court. Passers-by watched, some murmuring words of gratitude and support, while others just stared in awe. James, with his indomitable calm, had given everyone a lesson in humility and dignity that would resonate far beyond this airport. It was not just a victory for him, but for every person who faced similar injustices every day. The governor, always in the company of his father, did not need words to confirm the significance of this act of courage. Together, they moved away, leaving behind a transformed scene, a suspended moment where dignity had triumphed and where acts of justice had taken a concrete form, visible to all.